So specifically to Angel and Ritsume Kan's Tokyo seminars in Japanese law and Kyoto seminars in Japanese law that are hosted, tell us a little bit about your involvement in that program as well.
We in that course we teach in a period of a couple of hours as much as we can about taxation law, with a primary focus on a comparative Japanese Australian tax law. And again, drilling down into looking at where there's an overlap or where there's sort of, for example, if there's an Australian who goes to Japan or a Japanese person who comes to Australia. So we look at the sort of residency rules and the source of income rules. And then we apply that in the context of some case studies. And we sort of have a bit of fun with the students because we focus on how, as a tax advisor, you might try and assist your client in stepping through these rules. I hesitate to use avoid these rules, but stepping through these rules in a tax effective way. And then we look at, if we have time, we also look at a sort of current case study between Japan and Australia, whereby quite a lot of Australians own property in the SECO, and what happens if they sell that property, make a capital gain, where is it taxed? How do the tax authorities find out about any capital gains that have been made, and so on. So we really try and start off with some basic principles and then drill down into some specific case studies to show how these principles work.
What about your research, the relevant areas of your research?
Yeah, well, my research has sort of taken a slight deviation in the last decade. As a tax professor, traditionally I was interested mainly in international tax, and then I started to become interested in carbon taxes and pricing carbon using fiscal measures. And that was at the same time that I was working in Japan, and it was sort of serendipitous because we had this leadership role that was being taken by both Japan and Australia at that time. It seems hard to believe now, but at that stage we were two countries that were leading the charge to try and reduce emissions using the tax system, basically. And then, unfortunately, we had the triple disaster in Japan and a rethink about the costs associated with decarbonising. And in Australia, we had a Conservative government elected who had completely different views as to whether, in fact, even climate change was occurring. So we retreated, not that we completely moved away from using tax measures. Both Japan and Australia do have some measures they use today to try and price a carbon or try and create a market for carbon. And that's really what I've been focusing
on. Do you have any kind of commentary on the changes we might see in this area over the next, say, decade or so?
Well, I have hopes and wishes, that's for sure, and some reality checks as well. But one of the aspects that I'm enthusiastic about, and in fact the Australian government asked me to look at this measure. It's a measure the Japanese government has introduced called the joint crediting mechanism. And the way it works is Japanese businesses are encouraged to enter into joint ventures with third world businesses or businesses in third world countries. And these joint ventures are designed to reduce carbon, and then they will generate credits for the carbon that's reduced, whether it be Indonesia or Vietnam or whatever. And then those credits can be sold, and that's the value of that is what entices the first world companies, the Japanese companies, to engage in these activities. And also there's a potential for these credits to be used, or at least claimed by Japan as its contribution to reducing emissions throughout the world. And the Australian government particularly asked me to look at this mechanism and see whether it could be adopted in Australia. And indeed, I've spent many years researching it and made a submission to that effect, that it could really easily fit within our scheme of different measures. So fingers crossed, that is something Australia might embrace into the future. In terms of otherwise what we're likely to see, because that measure on itself won't be enough to reduce emissions as much as we've promised we will as a country. In Japan, there's definitely going to be a move to nuclear power. It's funny how time sort of fades the memory. Who would have thought 8-9 years ago that was even a possibility, but that is likely to be the major Japanese response, I think, to reducing emissions rather than tax measures or the like. And in Australia, well, who knows is really the question here. Really, at the moment we have this technology-focused approach that our technology would drive emissions down. But there's a lot of sort of wishful thinking in that, and we really will need to have some measures that have an economic incentive for businesses to reduce their emissions.
Can you comment on how COVID has affected the development of the law in your areas of interest?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly initially with the world effectively shutting down, it was almost as if the Earth had some breathing space because emissions plummeted across the globe, and it gave us a chance to maybe get a year or two more to do something. And now as we gradually move out of the lockdown, there's two possibilities. One is that we will pivot towards green energy as the new employment growth area and a chance to sort of restart almost again. That is one possibility. The second possibility, which unfortunately, as I see it, is probably more likely, is that the old industries, the fossil fuel dominated industries, will be given tax incentives to encourage them to fire up in more ways than one, and employ more people, or hopefully. And we already are seeing that in Australia with the concessions provided to the gas industry. And even last week, there was a further concession provided to the petroleum industry in Australia that didn't receive much publicity. But I think this idea of using tax breaks to encourage existing fossil fuel industry is likely to be more common than not.
Mm. In addition to the effects that COVID might be having on kind of our policy around environmental taxes, just more generally in the international tax law area, do you have any kind of editorialization about what's going on in the near to midterm future here?
It's a good question, Micah. A year ago, there was a definite trend towards convergence of tax systems around the world. In other words, there was an attempt to create almost like an international tax order, and every country would have a similar tax system, which was primarily designed to create a level playing field and to prevent opportunities for tax avoidance. But in the last year, there's been this sort of massive push back against globalisation, partly because of Trump's America, I guess, partly because of the troubles Australia's had with China, and a sort of perception that we need to encourage our own domestic enterprises and not be so reliant on overseas imports. And also partly because of this sort of fear of foreigners that's sort of prevailed because of COVID. So there seems to be this pushback. And so I foresee, and I think a few other people are sort of promoting this idea too, that we may see our tax systems begin to diverge again and become different to each other, particularly in the focus on encouraging domestic enterprise at the cost of foreign enterprise. So I think we might see, for example, tax breaks, which would encourage domestic business. At the same time, some sort of barriers are placed on foreign businesses operating within our shores. So I think that's a distinct possibility.
It would be an interesting development in how we teach this particular course as well, because I don't mean to speak for you, but I think in previous years we've spoken, and you introduced the course partially in this way. We've spoken about how there are these areas of overlap, and the course kind of focuses on some of the basics of international law, with a focus on kind of what might be somewhat specific to Australia and Japan. But our general tenor of that has been, Japan can illustrate some of these general ideas floating around in international tax law, but tax law isn't is not one of the areas where we rely heavily on talking about kind of cultural determination and things like that. Japan, isn't particularly Japanese when it comes to just talking about tax law.
Yeah.
But this might provide an opportunity, because every country will, should they start to engage in tax law-based protectionism, they'll do it in their own particular way. So that would be quite an interesting way in which the way we teach the course could change as well.
No doubt about tax law. It really is interesting, isn't it, Micah?
Always, always. Thank you for taking the time to speak with us today, Justin. I'm hoping the next time we get to have a conversation like this, it's in person in front of the students in Tokyo, though I suspect that won't be 2021, obviously, but hopefully 2022 we get to do that. Thank you very much.
Yes, my pleasure, Michael. Good to see you. Bye.
Bye-bye.